So when we're looking at goal setting theory as a practical application in organizations, one of the most common types of a top-down or basically a intervention which is aimed at affecting an entire organization by instilling the concept of goal setting into that organizational structure is called management by objectives, or MBO. So MBO is a specific technique for setting goals, and the idea is that you're setting systematic goals throughout the organization in such a way that they're objective goals that can be measured, that the way you manage is by setting these goals, and that the way performance is increased is by people attaining the goals, and that each goal at each level of the organization builds on both goals above it and below it. So it's aimed at an integration of individual and organizational goals throughout the organization. And it's a system to help the planning, organizing, and problem solving and motivating of employees. So basically, it's a one shot kind of intervention that's focused at the idea of all planning within an organization is going to go through the managements by objective system. It's going to allow us to organize our organization. It's going to allow us to conceptualize how organizational broad goals translate down to individual goals. And that also, because we have this system that's looking at objectives and goals, and hopefully the management part is helping people obtain those goals, it also becomes the tool for both motivating and problem solving employee problems. MBO involves participation of both subordinates and their managers throughout the organization, and both parties are setting to and clarifying the goals for the subordinate. So again, we have that integration. So management by objective basically is a kind of applied or practice-oriented answer to integrating everything we've already talked about as far as what we know about goal setting into one kind of one-size-fits-all management package that can be added to an organization. So how does it work? We start with managers and subordinates jointly identifying common goals. So throughout the organization, there is going to be time where managers and their subordinates or direct reports are meeting to identify what are the goals of the individual and how does that fit the bigger goal of the organization. Define major areas of responsibility in terms of the results expected. So what is the expectations of these goals? Is the person being asked to do something they have control over and have the resources to obtain? And this is also kind of a process of identifying when goals may not actually be individual goals, but more of group level goals, team level goals, departmental level goals. Because again, the idea is that we're no longer using just goal setting at various levels of an organization. This is an integrative approach of the entire organization trying to manage through objectives. We then need to use measurement as guides for operating and assessing the contributions. So one of the things about managing by objectives is those objectives themselves do need to be measurable so that they can actually be used as a management tool. Clarify organizational goals and plans at all levels and gain a better motivational and participation from organizational members. So this is, again, basically kind of trying to create a package of an intervention that's going to work throughout an organization, building on what we know about goal setting. So generally the phases of integrating or instigating a management by objective policy is first, the top management team needs to study the entire system. And this will often involve external OD specialists coming in and helping with this process of how are we currently managing? How are we currently communicating goals? How are we currently communicating objectives? And what should those goals and objectives be? The team then sets up methods for measuring performance. So the second phase is really one of the key components of managing by objectives, and that is that the objectives themselves need to be objective. They need to be measurable in an easy way to where objectives are always tied to something you can put down in concrete, if you will, in black and white, you obtained or you didn't obtain your goal. So management by objective by its nature is trying to stay away from subjective goals like increase your overall customer service. That would not be a management by objective. Reduce your complaints in customer service from 10% to 7%. That's a measurable objective. So goal setting sessions are then held at all levels of the organization. So once the organization itself determines what are the organizational goals and how are we objectively measuring them, that information then is communicated at each level below the top level of the organization, the top management team, to each organizational department or program or team or group of how their individual part of that plays into that larger goal. So what are their goals? Then once those mid-levels know their goals, they set the individual goals all throughout the organization. So the steps in this process, once it's actually instigated, is individually, subordinates will first propose specific goals and suggestions on how to measure those goals for the designated time period. The subordinate and the superior will jointly develop mutually agreed upon goals. So basically, an interactive process where the subordinate or direct report actually has voice in what is the goal that I need to obtain, and here's how it's measured. But that's also then going to be altered or possibly negotiated with the actual supervisor. Then the period of performance occurs, and during that performance, feedback for results with comparisons between actual performance and goals should be a part of the process. And again, this is a cyclic process. So once that time period is over, it's ascertained whether the goals were met, and new goals would then be established. So ideally, the steps in the MBO process should be a cyclic process that's going all the way down the organization and all the way back up. So at each level of the organization, no matter how many levels there should be those 5 steps we just discussed. The subordinates will be proposing their goals. The supervisors will meet with them to finalize those goals. A time period of performance will occur. During that performance period, feedback will be given whether the goals are attained. And finally, the cycle starts up again with setting the stage for the new set of goals to be set. Now, within each one of those cycles, the goals themselves, further goals will be entering into that cycle from higher levels as goals change throughout the organization. And also the success of those goals will feed in to whether the goals of the higher levels are being obtained. So if we start at that lower level, if the goals there are being failed, that's giving feedback up to the mid-level that their goals probably are not being succeeded either because they're dependent on those lower level goals, which means that the mid-level may decide that they're changing their goals and how they're managing the lower level goals, which would then feed back down to that lower level. Again, this can get fairly complex, but like I said, the idea behind management by objective is to create an integrative system of goals from the very top to the very bottom. So some of the criticisms of this process, of criticisms of MBO, first, it is very expensive and time consuming. It basically takes managers that may have been more focused on administrative tasks back to actually being hands-on managers and meeting frequently with their direct reports. It's traditionally limited to managerial and professional employees where costs can be justified. So I mentioned that it should be all the way from the top to all the way from the bottom. That works fairly well in kind of professional settings, but if we're looking at a manufacturing plant, if we're looking at more kind of semi to low skilled labor, a lot of times we'll find that this is a fairly expensive system, especially the amount of time that we're taking out of actual production to management meetings to set these goals. Joint goal setting among unequals is difficult and may not be possible. So, of course, ideally, what we know from goal setting theory is that a goal that is moderately difficult and objectively measured is better at motivating, especially if the person has a strong voice in helping to set that goal. And a part of management by objectives does include the idea that the subordinates and the supervisors are talking to each other to set these goals. But it's important to remember that if you're doing management by objective, that manager has goals themselves, and those goals have been set by people above them, which means the lower you go in the organization, the less and less likely that you are actually going to have as much control over what kind of goals you're setting as a subordinate. Some people have pointed out that management by objective, by its very nature, is quantitative. Everything needs to be objectively measured, which means some very key components of performance in an organization may be ignored and unrewarded. So basically, if an area can't be easily quantified, it may often be ignored. MBO may also be implemented as a top-down dictating to the bottom, and this is a pretty easy trap to fall into because at the very top level of the MBO process is top-level management setting organizational level goals, which is going to strongly dictate and flavor any further goals throughout that organization. And within the field of organizational development, many practitioners question whether MBO is actually an OD intervention by its very nature. It's not that goal setting isn't organizational development, but remember, one of the key assumptions of organizational development is the idea that we are tailoring interventions for specific situations. MBO is not very tailorable. It is a package deal that is supposed to affect an entire organization. I kind of referred to it earlier as a one size fits all kind of intervention. And therefore, a lot of people do question there's not a lot of room to maneuver. So, where an organizational development practitioner might suggest goal setting in different ways in different parts of the organization, this is a standardization of goal setting throughout an organization, regardless of the level or the type of job being impacted. As far as results of MBO, it's been fairly difficult for empirical research to measure the success or failure of MBO, primarily because every organization is going to implement it in different ways. And I've already pointed out a couple of the areas where we can kind of see the potential for some of the advantages of a goal setting theory being implemented in an organization to not work as well as it should. So one of those key components is trying to make sure that people have a voice in it. And I've already kind of talked about how sometimes that might be difficult. The fact that it may come across very directive when we're using MBO because those overall organizational objectives are driving the bottom level objectives. So basically, the different approaches to MBO, how organizations implement it, do they implement it completely? Do they implement it completely without falling into one of these traps? Means a fair lack of consistency in the empirical data of whether MBO really does work to change over organizations. So basically, what I'm saying is you can find small ends of one, in other words, individual companies that have instigated an MBO program very well and have seen great feedback and great success and really swear by it. And some organizations still use MBO as the way they manage. It also has a certain amount of appeal because it kind of defines what does management mean, and it is setting an entire organization to actually ask what are our measurable objectives. So the absence of current research provides measure of a declining use. And what that means is we're seeing less and less research on MBO, which also means we're probably seeing less organizations trying this as a new intervention. We're probably seeing less organizational development practitioners suggesting MBO as a broad level intervention. And mainly we're just seeing some organizations that have already adopted it or maintaining it. Other organizations have tried it and have found that it just doesn't fit their culture or the way of the business they do. So the research has kind of reported mixed results.